All right, so without further ado, I want to introduce our first keynote speaker. And again, as I read through his bio, our first keynote speaker is Chris Brown. He's the CTO of Opscode. And as I read through his bio, I thought, you know, he's a nerd. He's definitely a nerd. We'll ask him when he comes on stage here. But Chris, he's got a great background. He worked at Amazon, one of the inventors of EC2, Director of Engineering at Microsoft, and a big proponent of DevOps, which is something we are pushing heavily through our organization today, where we're trying to get our development organization connected with our operations organization to ensure that what we build will run well in production and higher quality and provide what our clients need. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Chris to the stage, and we'll get going here.
Thank you very much.
All right, so Chris, which is it?
Oh, definitely nerd.
Definitely nerd. All right.
Where I come from, geeks are the carny folks that bite the heads off of chickens.
Yeah.
I think I'd rather be a nerd.
Exactly. All right, it's yours.
Thank you very much. I feel right at home. I actually have a 1981 Donkey Kong Jr. full-size cabinet in my living room at home. It's got a MAME emulator inside, and my son's favorite game is Galaga. So I think we're off to a good start. We're not going to compare high scores, however. All right, so I'm going to take the next, looks like I got about 45 minutes to talk about DevOps, but from an interesting perspective, at least seems to be to me. I think that, and I've been in the industry about 20 years now, I think this transformation that we're going through right now is probably the biggest and most interesting that I've seen, and I'd like to share with you what I'm seeing so far. So I call this a business transformation in 3 acts. It's not just about DevOps, as we'll see. It's first of all about people. It's about me, it's about all of you, and it's about the communities that we build. It turns out that DevOps is actually more, if you think about it, a psychological experiment. It's a reaction to things that are happening to us in business, and I'll talk about that. It's, you know, it's stories, it's interactions, and it serves a greater purpose. Talk a bit about the business as well, this, you know, edifice that stood for, you know, hundreds of years. Business itself is changing dramatically. You might feel it as well. This change from physical manufacturing and delivery to digital delivery and digital consumption, and this radical change in a very, very short time, right? And we'd like to think that within that change we can do something like, you know, sprinkle the magic Web 2.0 fairy dust on top of whatever it is we do today, and suddenly you've got that new business, and it turns out that it's not quite that easy, right? We'll talk about the pressures behind the business and on all of us to deliver. And finally, if we have some time left, I'll talk about the technology a little bit. Some of the tips and tricks that I've learned, that I've run into, that I think will help us deliver on this new vision. Very, very quickly, I said this is about people. That's me. This was at the, very grainy picture, this was at the Velocity conference a couple years ago. How many of you know about Velocity? Not as, okay. One more person there. That's Adam Jacob, one of our co-founders and the original author of Chef. We are the makers of Chef, Configuration Management Framework. Wanted to mention Velocity because this, in some sense, is where DevOps as a movement got its start. This was the coming out party, both for the movement and for a number of small companies like mine that were recognizing these changes. It was started by folks from companies like Amazon and Yahoo, and joined by Google and Facebook. And if you think about the complexion of that, the folks that show up there, it's very representative of this movement, right? But before that, as you heard, I was this guy. I know, I had to, it's gratuitous. Worked as a director of engineering at Microsoft. The goal in the Edge Computing Network was to put these small nuggets of dynamic compute, of content delivery and storage, within 30 milliseconds of latency of all the tier 1 internet customers in the world. And our notion there was, you shorten the latency, you have a much better customer experience, everybody's happier, right? Again, it's all about that delivery. It's all about digital delivery. More fun, though, before that, I got to be this guy. This was so much fun. This is a picture of us opening the office. The first 2 years of development of EC2 was actually in Cape Town, South Africa. Very strange thing. There's an entire story to tell there. But I got a chance to start on the ground floor of that and watch it turn into something that is revolutionizing the way we deliver. I mean, you think about it, somewhere between 5 and 10 years ago, you would have never thought of a service like that where you could get, ubiquitous compute on demand, and now it's compute and storage and all the ancillary services. I spoke to some principals at a VC fund. This has been 2 or 3 years ago now. They said all of their infrastructure startups were running on EC2 or something like it. All of them. But enough about me. So who are you? I want to find out. How many of you are in software engineering? There we go. How many of you identify as systems administrators? Fewer. If you had a role called DevOps, how many of you would self-identify? Wow. Fewer still. How many of you are business people? Yeah, I see like 5 hands, mostly in the front. That, by the way, is a trick question. It turns out in this transformation, we're all business people. Your decisions affect the top line of the business every day, if we're doing it right. And the business requirements, those are the things that educate you on what you should be building and how we should be testing. And this is actually part of the DevOps movement, as you'll see, this re-identification of being closer to the top line. All right, step 1, the people. To give you some perspective on that piece of it, this is the way the business, I would say, in the last generation used to look, right? The tech people were off at the edge of the galaxy. Quite often, they're in their own facility, away from everyone else. I used to joke at Microsoft as I would go from building to building, you could smell it when you walked into the marketing building because it smelled better. And typically, the CEO is somewhere else, fairly far removed. Typically, in the last generation, CEOs came from sales or marketing or finance, the portions that you would typically ascribe to being the business. But they weren't typically from a high-tech background. Now, for you here, that may be a little different. I'm speaking of the industry in a wider sense. But there are some interesting ramifications to this, right? So the CEO looks across the business and makes some judgment calls. CEO says, salespeople are the best. Because they're the ones that actually go out and improve the top line of the business. They're the ones out making money, right? And if they're pressed about it, they say, oh, yeah, well, it's the product folks. They're the best because they actually are the muscle in manufacturing. They build the business. And by the way, most of the time in our business, those are the software engineers, right? So here begins the classic tension between the software engineers and the folks in operations. Because who gets the credit for most of what's delivered? It's typically the software engineers. And since it looked like about 80% of you in here are software engineers, I guess maybe that's okay. I'll just keep my mouth shut. Finally, though, so we get the sales folks, the product folks, and then, hey, it's the ops guys. Do I have to fire you? The site's down again. I'm like, okay, and they all walk away. By the way, I am a nerd. Does anybody know who those guys are? Oh, there's one person. Who are they? The Packlids. Anybody who watched Star Trek Next Generation? These were the guys that wanted to make it go. I always think of ops folks when I see this. Well, I just gave a whole lot away by saying that, didn't I? Then you get this. When I started researching this, so I've done a variant of this talk 2 or 3 times now. When I started researching this, asking folks about their experience in operations, I got this answer from people who work for me now, who said in their last jobs, they were actually hired to roll back code. that the software designers, the software engineers would write it, they'd package it up, it would go into a mystifying process somewhere and come out in ops land. The operations folks would be leaned on to deploy it, and they would, and it wouldn't work. And then who was to blame? It was the ops guys. Hey, you need to roll it back. That's serious inefficiency in the business, right? Not to mention the fact that the ops folks are the ones with the pagers waking up at 2 o'clock in the morning confused as to why things aren't working. And DevOps is supposed to fix that, right? That's the thing that we're trying to do. How many of you believe that DevOps does fix that or is in process of fixing it? Coincidentally, the exact same people who identified with DevOps earlier and nobody else. Like we need, the folks in the back need to move up here. So, unrelated to the rest of this, I was reading this article in Atlantic Magazine a while back, and it was about the healthcare industry. So that's pretty topical. The article is actually from 2009. But here's what I found to be interesting. Reading through, I'm just going to read the highlighted portions. A system that generates terrible and perverse results, that emphasizes treatment over prevention, that disguise true costs, favor complexity, and discourage competition based on price or quality. And I realized that that actually applies to the schism between development and operations quite often as well. And you can imagine what that does to your business. It's disguising the true costs because you look at the cost of development, what is considered the cost of manufacturing. But what you're not usually looking at is that cost of maintenance, what happens with the ops folks. So either the ops folks are just getting paid salary and waking up in the middle of the night and being on call on the weekends is just a perk. Or those folks, they ask for more money and you have to pay more, or they burn out. They churn out of the company and you lose the valuable skill set. So by not doing these things, we're disguising the true cost of the good that we actually produce. So here's what I propose. I propose an unholy union. So this is what most software developers are like. A little bit colorful, a little bit brash, kind of loud. I identify with this, by the way. I'm software engineer, distributed systems engineer, so it's not like I'm making fun of anybody else. Then we have operations. The folks below the waterline doing a great deal of the hard work. So what we want to do is put the bill on the beaver. Anybody want to chip in on the t-shirts? This is what we need. We need to come together. We need to share skills, more importantly, with one another. So it hasn't just been a separation of concerns, it's been a separation of skill sets completely. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how we can actually bring those skill sets together. Finally, I was talking to a gentleman who's fairly high-placed in a multinational corporation, good-sized corporation. He told me this story, and I'm not sure how true it is, but it's a good story. CEO sat down with the CFO and the various heads of divisions within their company in a quarterly review. CEO looks at each of the division heads and says, well, all right, for the quarter, how are we doing? Each of the division heads says, well, we made our goals for the quarter, we're doing well, whatever the numbers are, X, Y, everything's great. Each of the division heads. CEO turns to the CFO and says, all right, for the quarter, how did we do as a business? And the CFO says, I'm sorry to report, yet again this quarter we lost money. CEO looks at the CFO, looks at the division heads and says, sorry guys, I guess I have to fire the CFO because somewhere between here and there, he lost your money. And everybody looks around and they're kind of shocked. And then they realize the thing that actually happened, nobody made the diving catch, right? When the ball falls between the fielders, in this case between the divisions, no one felt responsible for actually making the catch. Each division met its own goals. It didn't actually meet the company's goals. And the same thing is true for development and operations. If we set separate goals, no one is responsible for the entire outcome. We can succeed separately and fail as a group. So how do we help? So Patrick Dubois is one of the voices in the DevOps community. And actually, if we can track it back, probably the guy who came up with the term DevOps in the first place. He says, this is what we look like, folks who are proponents of DevOps. 30-something sysadmin coders. And I thought that part right there was interesting. Didn't identify simply as systems administrators, but identified as sysadmin coders. Because what we're finding, the folks at Opscode, when we go out and look around, the folks in the greater DevOps community, is that we're entering into an era that we've been calling the coded business. Everybody writes code. If digital delivery is your thing, it's not just the software engineers writing the code. Systems administrators are as well. And that the sysadmins, the folks in operations, understand writing software is about making money. It's about shipping product. They tend to be pragmatic and delivery-oriented folks. That's the set of skills that they bring to the table. It's interesting when you talk to most systems administrators, say, well, are you a coder? And they'll say, no, that's not my job. And in fact, you find that they're writing bash scripts, Perl scripts, Apache configs, all sorts of things that, if they're not already actually coding, approach coding. So if you're a developer, go and make friends with the sysadmins. If you're using configuration management software, Puppet or Chef, start contributing. I understand you folks are actually going through this process as well, where you're getting into both consuming open source and possibly publishing open source, which is, it's the rising tide that floats all boats. We're all getting so much out of that effort, right? So here's what's happening ahead of us. I'm going to talk a little bit about a timeline for a moment, sort of the history of DevOps, and then where we are today. Anybody here know who these guys are? John Allspaw or Paul Hammond? Okay. How many people know about Flickr? Almost everybody knows about Flickr. This talk at Velocity, this was 2009, this talk blew everyone's minds. This was amazing. 10 deploys a day these folks were doing. Most companies were lucky to do deploys weekly or monthly, and these guys were doing it all day long. They could have done more if they'd wanted to. And this was all about the cooperation between the developers writing the code and the ops folks who were then responsible for that when it was out in the world. This changed everything. This was in 2009, right? So keep that date in mind. Also, like I said, Velocity. This was the proving ground for so many of the early ideas. A lot of, I think it's for the past 2 years, Velocity talks have all been recorded, are online. I think you might actually have to purchase them, and there might be some larger license for it. Definitely worth going back and looking at. So here's how it works. Every discipline, be it physical engineering, software engineering, or operations, passes through the same maturity curve. I apologize for the contrast on this, probably can't really read it. First step is a craft. Somebody figures it out. Someone starts doing a thing and making shoes or pottery, almost doesn't matter what it is. Brand new piece of technology. They start teaching it to other folks. There's a set of best practices. It becomes reproducible. At that point, the craft turns into a trade. Now we've got the best practices. We can not only reproduce the goods, we can reproduce the people who make the goods. And then beyond that, we figure out what it is in that process that makes it good and how to make it better. We build a theory. So we've gone beyond best practices, and now we've got something that's really teachable from first principles. So then we get a science. And I contend that that's the path that we're all on, both in software engineering and in operations, which is why I like to talk about operations science. But it's important to know where we are in that path. So you look at computer science, by the way, who knows who that guy is? Anybody? It's John McCarthy, the inventor of Lisp. Quite often somebody yells out, Colonel Sanders. And I didn't realize it until after it totally looks like Colonel Sanders. This guy's kind of my hero. Early computer scientist, like I said, inventor of Lisp in the 50s. He wrote one 7-page paper that basically changed the industry. So computer science, the same sort of thing. We started off with very few computers, no standards, a few people who were programmers. Best practices came out of that, and suddenly we had engineering as a discipline. I really shouldn't say suddenly, it was a fairly slow process. And then finally, with more theory, it was elevated to a science. So when you go to school now, there are actually sometimes two tracks. There is software engineering, and there's computer science. And they're not the same thing. But what's odd about that is it was initially believed impossible that computers could be a scientific field of study, right? It's only been since the 50s this has actually happened. But now we've reached the point where there is so much theory out there in computer science, and most of it is math, right? That's another interesting point. When you're building a new discipline, you typically beg, borrow, steal concepts from the disciplines around you. So steal from math, steal from physics. In academia, it's okay to steal, right? This was only, like I said, this was since the 50s that this has been happening, and it really took a long time for it to be an established discipline. So where are we for operations? So we started out with hackers, the Unix neckbeards, right? The folks who were typically in the back room and very surly, the high priests of the small number of computers that we had. And they started teaching their best practices to others, and then we got systems administration. And at least now we have folks out there with business cards in the world that say systems administrator on them. There is a trade. This is what people do for a living, and they get paid for it. What we don't have in operations is the thing that comes next. What comes after the best practices? We don't have a theory. We don't have a science. We don't have a degree program. Now, I contend in some sense that's part of the friction and part of what's holding operations back, is it's simply not seen as being a front seat participant in the same way that other disciplines are, but I think we're on the path to making it so. DevOps is actually part of that. I thought I was so smart when I figured that out. I thought I was the first guy to latch onto this maturity curve thing. Then I realized Steve McConnell actually wrote about this book after the gold rush. This is mostly about experiences at Microsoft and the rise of software as a product. Wrote about this in 1999, and I love this quote. In the long term, software engineering practice needs to be elevated to a level at which it can support the next generation of technological miracles. That's fabulous. I think we're in a period now, as I've said, where things are changing so quickly, it is almost like magic. What's the Arthur C. Clarke quote? Anything sufficiently technologically advanced appears to be magic. We're getting close to that with the things that we produce with our own hands. 1999, like I said, John and Paul gave their talk at Velocity in 2009. So at the very least, there's 10 years of difference between operations and the recognition that software engineering already has in the industry. And that's important to consider when you're thinking about where we are on that path. So how do we build it? How do we get to the next level? That's appropriate. I just realized with the video games, it is about getting to the next level. So what DevOps isn't? So Ari Pinar, another voice in the European DevOps community, thought this was interesting. You search the internet for guides or books on systems administration practices, you're going to find some best practices, but you're not going to find anything that's substantive, that takes you to the next level. What is there is hard to digest for people who aren't that interested in being a full-time operations guy. So it's interesting, there's that barrier to entry as well. Even if software engineers wanted to take the next step, they wouldn't know typically how to get into it. And in the past, you could start with a brand new engineer, somebody who is not yet jaded, stars in their eyes, 10 to 15 years to make them into a good ops person. Why is that? Because it's all about on-the-job training. It's all about learning and reproducing those best practices in a trade without knowing what the theory looks like, without knowing the why instead of the what. And that's really important. And the last part, pace is not sustainable. We need to adapt or die at this point. So this repeated theme about things are moving too quickly, we can't take 10 to 15 years to train someone when the next little piece of technology comes out every 6 months. How do you keep track of it, right? So, harping on the whole education thing for a moment, did a little Google search. Can you get a PhD in DevOps? And I learned two interesting things. One is that there's a lot of PHP out in DevOps, and the other one is that HP's hiring. In case, anybody's looking for a job. That one kind of scared me. So I mentioned this before, just some of the same things. This is actually from the definition of systems administration from Wikipedia, of all places. Difficulties with teaching system administration. And the last quote there, learning institutions are reluctant to teach hacking to undergraduate students. So again, it's that notion that this is not a discipline that's been elevated. What are we going to teach? This is just hacking. It's not. A, it's not. And B, it shouldn't be. We need to write down some of that theory. We need to elevate operations into being its own science. And it's not like there's nothing out there at all. There are a few books that are really starting to light the way. And when I mentioned beg, borrow, and steal from other disciplines, that's what you're seeing at the beginning. We're doing the right thing. So the book on the left up there, Neil Gunther's Guerrilla Capacity Planning, that's really, and you can probably tell by the cover, it's really a math book disguised as capacity planning for ops folks. Really good, but very much you open it up and it looks like a math book. Mark Burgess. How many of you know about CF Engine or about Mark Burgess? Okay. Mark Burgess is a professor at a university in Norway. His background is in applied physics and mathematics. Yet what he tells you he is a systems administrator. And he wrote the book in the middle there, Network and System Administration. So again, we're getting folks who are, finally, established academics who have a wealth of theory in something and are applying the same terms and the same principles to our space. And if those books are hard to approach, then we have John Allspaugh's book, The Art of Capacity Planning. It's about half an inch thick, still kind of math, but mostly the easy stuff. That's what we need to start handing out. That's where we all need to get started. Finally, another plug, interestingly enough, also health-related. The Checklist Manifesto. Atul Gawande is a surgeon, and he wrote this book about making checklists and about improving patient outcomes. Same thing applies to aviation and the pre-flight checklist that pilots go through. I think it was, if I remember correctly, right after World War II, during World War II and after, there was no pre-flight checklist on large bombers, and every once in a great while they'd forget to flip an engine on. Turns out there were a number of crashes associated with not having gone through the same repeatable steps every time they took off. Simple as that. But my favorite quote here, should not let the learnings from other fields go to waste. There's decades of thinking and exploration there. Like I said, steal from everybody else to elevate your discipline. It applies to operations. It applies equally to software engineering, as this is still an ongoing process. This is one that personally a little bit irksome to me. I was talking before about the why versus the what. And this applies also to software engineering and to operations. Quite often, what we really need to do when we're looking at a problem is to solve it from first principles. And what we actually end up doing is we use phenomenology. So what I mean is, phenomenology is about the appearance of a thing and about your experience with a thing. So when you see a problem and you figure out how to solve it, what you do is in the back of your mind, you put that away. The next time you see a problem that looks like it, you think the same thing applies. Oh, last time I solved something that looked like this, I restarted this service or I changed the network interface. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. The problem is you're not understanding why. You can't prevent the issue from happening the next time. You're not really understanding it. What you need is first principles. And again, first principles goes back to theory and about writing these things down. And I hate to say it, gotta know some math. But you don't have to know calculus. I'm just waiting for everybody in the room to go, oh, thank you. You don't even have to know lambda calculus, although I really want to know who that guy is. That is just, although I gotta say I would do that. What you want to do though is, if you're responsible for building a software service or running a software service, a great deal of what you do, or even shipping box software when we talk about the performance of software, you need to know something about modeling, simple principles. And it's as easy as putting numbers in a spreadsheet in Excel, and if you want to be really sophisticated, using something like R or RStudio. But this is the part of math that I think that we need to steal away and make our own, because it applies to how we measure, like I said, how we measure the performance of services. It applies to how we measure the performance of software development teams in general. It's a whole lot of simple math that can be applied. And finally, like I said, it's about what we write down, and it's about what we share with others. What we lack so far, not having textbooks, is long-form prose, is a place to write down for others to see and interact with. And it's got to be more than just blogs, because blogs are basically, I publish a thing, it's my opinion, and then maybe you get some comments at the bottom. And typically the comments are snarky, right? It's not a forum for actual peer review, which is what the other sciences have. So if you know about Sightseer, this is where you go for academic papers. It's fabulous. This is a place that, as software engineers and as operations engineers, we need to get into. Published papers, easily searchable. Archive.org is the same sort of thing, but it's actually by category. Right? You can look for things in physics or mathematics or whatever category you want to mine. And then, of course, there are the conferences and organizations that are helping us. Usenix and Lisa are common examples for systems engineers. And finally, for the end, when I'm talking about people, it's really about the communities that we build. It's about how we interact with one another. And if we're building a community, what you need to expect others to behave responsibly, to hold them to a standard. Because if you don't, here's an example. I think Twitter is a horrible medium for real communication. This is an actual tweet that then was deleted shortly after. Do you treat people like this in public, this way? People that you know? When you take away respect for someone's past accomplishments, and then you start calling them names. So I had a discussion at dinner just last night about this, about how easy it is to get angry with somebody over email, and how much harder it is to do the same thing over something like Google Hangouts when you're talking and you can see the person. We have to set an expectation that we don't do these sorts of things. So what do? Well, this creates enormous inefficiencies, right? This creates friction. It actually stops folks from getting their jobs done. If you were to post something like that on Twitter about a junior engineer in your organization, do you think that person is going to try harder? Do you think they're going to hide the next time something difficult is expected of them? What ends up happening is those people they burrow away somewhere. You can't get them back. If you're in the open source communities, this is the best way to poison the well. Speak poorly of folks in your community, and they won't come back, and suddenly you don't have a community. So, do the other thing. Be nice to people. It's a lot easier to defuse situations with humor than it is to be unkind. Lead with questions, not with statements. This is a thing that is genetically difficult for engineers to do. We're all pretty sure we know the right way to do everything. And when you look at someone else's mistake, you say, well, it's trivial. What they should have done is, and you lead with a statement. Instead of asking the question, well, why did they make those choices? Was there time pressure involved? Were the technologies you would use not available? Understand the effort that they've put into it, right? All right, check the time here. Talk about the business for a moment. Now, I said much of this is about people. It's about us. But it's actually also about the interaction between the groups of people and the thing we call business. Like I said, this thing, the techniques have been around for decades, for hundreds of years. I think that they're rapidly changing. When we go out and we talk to customers, potential customers, we keep hearing the same words repeated. We hear words like transition, transformation, journey. Everybody's actually feeling this change already. The landscape around you is changing, as we've been saying, more quickly than skills are, right? It's creating, in some sense, a climate of fear, of expectation. If you take away one thing from what I say this morning, this would be it. The back office, what we used to consider IT, has now become the front office. IT actually is, not just for you folks here, but for so many other businesses, IT is actually the business. This is a fun little book to read. Gene Kim, who's also a proponent of the DevOps movement, wrote this little novel. It's basically a fable about IT and DevOps. And it's told from the perspectives of developers and security folks and the business folks and from the VP of operations at this company. Again, a great quote. In 10 years, every COO worth their salt will have come from IT. And that is definitely not true today. Any COO who doesn't intimately understand the IT systems that run the business is just an empty suit. I thought, wow, that's a threatening statement. I'm not sure the kind of reception Gene gets when he goes out and pitches his book. But this is a reflection of where we believe the business is going. IT is the business. What was historically just about internal efficiencies was about payroll management or human resources, SAP, paychecks, ADP, those things. Actually now has become the thing that you deliver to customers. Customers' preferred digital consumption is the front of the business. By the way, that picture there, that's the front to back Charleston. Best I could come up with. This also plays a role. Look at the time spans here. In the space of 40 years, we standardized the way physical goods are shipped. And then at that point, more than 70% by value of goods were shipped in containers, standardized containers. These move on trucks, you put them on ships, they stack them as high as they can, they lose 30% of them overboard in the middle of the ocean, and then they ultimately get to where they're going. In half that time, we achieved the same penetration of internet connectivity in North America. So already the pace has changed. And what can you do from that? By the way, thank you, Ops. Another plug for a book, When Sysadmins Ruled the Earth by Cory Doctorow. Definitely another nerd book. And it's about operations folks who keep large search engines and websites running during a national disaster. So 75% of Thanksgiving shoppers in 2011 shopped online, right? Or informed their purchases online. 75%. Now that ought to tell you right there, there's a definite preference. That is the business. And if you look at internet use around the world, this graph tells you a couple of things. First of all, there we are. We're way off the 70% already. We're going to achieve that singularity point where every device in your house has an IP address, right? It's not very far off. The other important thing, look at how the global internet penetration and the developing world track. They're almost exactly the same curve. What that tells you right there is that there are far more folks in the developing world than there are in the currently developed world. And that's the next market. There are billions and billions of folks to reach globally with our goods. 95% of the Western world already owns a cell phone. I don't know if you've seen GSM cell phone penetration in Africa. It's more likely that folks, at least in the southern part of Africa where I lived, it's more likely they had cell phones than bank accounts. Half the people own smartphones. Almost everybody will. How many of you in the room have an iPhone? Yeah, creepy, isn't it? How many of you have Android phones? Wow, that's, yeah, absolutely amazing. These numbers are actually old, right? Roughly one smartphone for every 2 people on the planet. I don't know about you. How many of you have teenage children? Yeah. So how many of you have multiple cell phones in the same house? Maybe more than one per person? I think I have every iPhone that's come out. And software is the interface, right? This is the way people have chosen to consume. Do you know what this display is? That's the Prius. What I really wanted, I didn't get a chance, I wanted to put a photo of that sweet 17-inch display from the Tesla Model S. It's gorgeous. I got my first chance to ride in one the other day, and I totally want to replace that photo. Just gorgeous. Started with books, right? Look at Amazon. Everyone knows the story of Amazon. Went from there, touching all of the high-end brick-and-mortar companies. Nordstrom, very serious now about delivery online in a way that they weren't just a few years ago. Part of that, as you can imagine, Nordstrom very well known for shoes, right? When Amazon bought Zappos.com, the fight was on. Spreads to everything. How many of you actually cash a physical paycheck or have seen a physical paycheck in the last few years? It's like one, there are 2 people back there who trust nothing. So here's what happened. Applications, online applications, became customer service vehicles. This is a brand new opportunity, right? Brand new opportunity to please customers. If you look at Sam Walton from Walmart, we like to refer to him as the Genghis Khan of rural retail, right? He rode over the top of everything. Where is there not a Walmart? He says, the goal as a company is to have customer service that is not just the best, but legendary. He understands it. Customer service is the thing that drives the business, right? You look at Jeff Bezos. If you make customers unhappy on the internet, they can each tell 6,000 friends. And that's what we're up against. This is a fabulous opportunity to please or to displease vast numbers of folks at a click. So back to DevOps and how it relates to this business. So hopefully I've convinced you that the face of business itself is changing dramatically. DevOps is in fact a reaction to this. It's a cultural, and professional movement that grew directly out of the experience of people who were on the front lines. And you think it's this thing that stands apart, that's somehow new or different. It's not. It's an application. It's a direct application to what we already know in IT. It's simply a way for us to react more quickly to the change in business. Last point here, business adaptations encapsulated in DevOps will eventually be ubiquitous. Why is that? Well, obviously, it applies to everything in today's industry. The next thing you hear after DevOps is continuous delivery for exactly the same reason. It's about delivering this customer experience as quickly and as safely as possible. So we've already talked about quickly, but safely matters just as much. Why is that? Well, if you can rush to deployment more quickly with a horrible experience, you're actually losing customers, right? What you need to do is you need that ability to be agile. Agile comes up a lot, right? Agile methodologies. To be agile, but to deliver safely and repeatably all the time. Failure to do so impacts customer satisfaction. And all of this is a matter of perspective between software engineers and operations folks. When you look at DevOps, driven from the operations side, and you look at continuous delivery, which is mostly driven from applications from the software engineers, they're a reaction to the same business problem. They're actually coming together in the middle. It's that ability to deliver quickly, safely, reliably to the actual business goals. So at the end of the day, development and operations are not actually that far apart. They're applying many of the same terms and the same techniques. So then, how can we all be great at this? Well, here's what we've figured out so far. This is Adam and I get to speak for Adam since he's not here. All the folks we talk to, every success story out there shares some common traits, and every failure lacks at least one of them. And it's interesting because when we go out and give advice, we give the same advice every time. Some of these companies succeed, some of them don't do quite as well. Every success story shares some common traits, so we'll talk about those. First of all, the map is not the territory. As I said, DevOps is actually a reaction to the business. It's not a thing that stands alone. It's much like Agile and Scrum, where folks thought that they could paste that over the top of current practices and it suddenly made you better. It doesn't. It's not about the practice. It's what the practice enables. You don't have to call it DevOps. It doesn't matter. What you should be thinking about is bringing together groups of people with different skills to a common goal and being able to deliver quickly and safely. So as I said, continuous delivery, same thing. It's a response to a shift in that pace of delivery and innovation. This one is really important. Sorry for the wall of text up there. It's about personal empowerment. It's about giving those folks in the small teams responsibility and accountability. And that accountability falls, as I've said, on the developers as much as it does the ops folks, because you don't get that chance to roll back the burning building later. Right? You have functional teams, and they share this responsibility across all of the disciplines. Architecture, security, systems administration, QA, right? If you're shipping, what I'd consider box software. And then business leaders who set the priorities and who interact and communicate directly with these small teams. Companies that get this wrong, I couldn't believe it, by the way. So I live on Lake Sammamish in Washington, and we have boat docks right by the house. And I saw this, and I thought, yeah, one day. Companies that get this wrong, typically you see centralized decision-making policies, distant from the actual delivery of the goods, and lots of gates in between that don't have a lot to do with the business, but have something to do with the business structure. Typically, you can't point at individuals and say that person is responsible for the outcome. The outcome is spread or shifted in such a way that, we don't like to use the word blame, right? There's no one to blame. Typically, those businesses have few what we call full stack engineers. When I was at Amazon, there was a core of a dozen or so what we called principal engineers, whose responsibility across the entire company was one of coming together and ensuring that there were common technologies and common understanding, and that everyone was informed by that group of everything that happened from top to bottom in the stack, from, at the time, from the Perl and Mason that delivered pages on the website to the C++ or Java applications that actually were the services behind it. You need folks who understand it stem to stern. No one stands alone. Right? The corollary to that is some teams that fail have architects who actually don't have responsibility, but simply bungee in, tell folks how it ought to be, and then bungee out without being responsible for the outcome. It really comes down to responsibility. Companies that succeed treat failure as a learning opportunity. Now, failure and learning go hand in hand, right? Sidney Decker's book as well, or essay rather, 10 Questions About Human Error. This is an analysis of big errors, things like plane crashes, right? Progress on safety coincides with learning from failure. This makes punishment and learning mutually exclusive, right? If you listen to somebody like John Allspaw, who goes out and gives talks about how to do a good post-mortem after an outage, what he says over and over is, it's not about the blame. You have to have a no-blame post-mortem, because that's how people learn. If you blame someone, if they don't get fired, because I've been in that culture too, if they don't get fired but they get blamed, they're not even going to pull a switch the next time. What you get is a business that doesn't move because everyone is afraid to execute. You can't be afraid to execute. You need to put processes in place, you need to put review in place, but you cannot be afraid to execute. Finally, become allergic to anything that makes you slow. This is great. So Phil Dibowitz, he's a production engineer at Facebook. And I don't know if you have an idea in your head about what people at Facebook look like. Phil is definitely that guy. He's got hair about down to here, and he actually tours with Metallica. He's one of the most interesting folks I know. And he says, the number one thing we can't do is get in people's way. Right? Whatever you want to do at Facebook, basically, if it leads to a business goal, you're allowed to do it. And the production engineers don't stand in the way. Contrast that to most of the places I've worked, where the production engineers, the ops folks, were that last bastion of defense against the developers making a stupid mistake. And finally, stop arguing about how it works and start measuring it. Be ruthless and be really addicted to metrics gathering, which also means that developers working in conjunction with ops folks to define the metrics on the inside of an application. When I was at Amazon, we had a meeting every week where all of the services that exposed APIs to the world, which included the main website, because page load time is effectively the performance metric of the business, everyone got together and went slavishly through their response times. And you had to justify if it got slower, you had to justify if it got faster, because maybe it's wrong if it gets faster. Don't look at things like averages. Averages mean nothing. The average experience means nothing. What you want to know is who's getting a good experience and who's getting a terrible experience, because the terrible experience is the one that everybody talks about. So what you want to look at is you want to look at the 90th, 95th, 99th percentile responses. If your 95th percentile response is very, very long, you know that there are 5% of the people out there in the world who really hate you. Guess which 5% go to Twitter, right? So measure everything. How are we doing here? Just about done. So understand the full scope of the transition in your business. What you want to do is you want to find a thing, if you think you're on this path to change, find a thing that you can change completely. Don't attempt to change the entire business. Don't make marginal changes within an existing piece of a product. Don't confuse the existing structures for hard business requirements. This is another thing I learned at Amazon. We had 2 pizza teams. A functional team was only as large as could be fed by 2 large pizzas. More people than that, they were probably in the way. That's the right set of folks to talk about an outcome. Typically in large companies, that requires a shift in thinking. You might not actually change reporting responsibilities, but what you will change is that interaction with the business leaders and those who are on the front lines. As I sort of mentioned, confine that blast radius, right? You don't want to try to change your whole business at once. Everyone is allergic to that. You'll build up this antibody response. But what you want to do is you want to take one thing and change it dramatically. And when that one thing changes and you can show success, then you get to change one other thing dramatically. And what you find sooner or later is you've changed the entire business. And finally, I said finally about 3 times now, didn't I? Reinforce your culture with the technology and vice versa. I love this quote, to Adam, my friend. Tooling is culture institutionalized. What you choose from a technology standpoint reflects your culture, and your culture adapts around the tools at hand. Again, it's about people, and it's about the choices that you make. There is no secret science. There is no thing called DevOps. There's no continuous delivery. It's actually about you. Still with me? All right. Perfect stopping point. Sorry I didn't get to the technology part, but that's it. Thank you very much.